When they gave us mirrors, we didn't recognize the women staring back. That line came from a diary found years later, its pages thin as onion skin, written by a German nurse named Greta Schultz. But in 1945, when she first stepped off the train in Kansas, she didn't know she was writing history. She only knew she was alive, barely, and in enemy hands. The air was dry and sharp, the kind that cracked your lips when you breathed. The war was over, but for the women stepping onto American soil, the word peace meant nothing. They expected cruelty, cold food, humiliation. The Reich had told them what Americans did to prisoners, and none of it was kind. Greta had worked in field hospitals across France, watching young soldiers die under white sheets. Now she was one of the defeated, her uniform wrinkled, her boots torn, her face hollowed by fear and hunger. Around her, other women clutched their few belongings, a comb, a letter, sometimes a photo of a man who would never come back. They were marched toward the camp gates, past wooden watchtowers and rows of barbed wire that glinted in the sunlight. Camp Concordia, the sign read, a word that meant harmony. It sounded like mockery. Inside, instead of the filth and overcrowding they expected, they found something stranger, order. The barracks were clean, the bunks freshly made. On the far side stood a long building with steam rising from its roof. A soldier pointed toward it. "Showers," he said simply. They hesitated. In Germany, that word had another meaning. One of the women began to tremble. Another whispered a prayer. But then an American guard, barely 20, his uniform too big for him, opened the door and smiled awkwardly. "You can wash up, ladies. Dinner's in an hour." Dinner? The women walked inside slowly, ready for betrayal. What they found instead were rows of sinks, warm water running from metal taps, and on the wall, mirrors. Big, clear, polished mirrors. For a long moment, no one moved. Then Greta stepped closer, almost afraid of what she'd see. The reflection staring back didn't look like her. The hair was dull and matted, the skin gray from exhaustion, the eyes older than they should have been. She touched her own face and flinched, as if meeting a stranger. Behind her, someone began to cry. Another woman laughed, but the sound broke halfway through, sharp and nervous. They had survived bombings, retreats, and defeat, yet this simple act of seeing themselves undone them completely. Later that evening, when they were led to the dining hall, the tables were set with plates, not tin bowls. Bread. Soup. Even coffee. It wasn't luxury, but it was dignity. The guard stood by quietly, watching the women eat in silence. No one shouted. No one pushed. One American sergeant leaned against the doorway and said quietly to another, "They look like ghosts." And maybe they were. Ghosts of a country that no longer existed, trying to remember what it meant to be human. That night, the women lay awake in clean sheets, listening to the faint hum of crickets outside. For the first time in years, there were no bombs, no sirens, no orders. Just the strange, almost unbearable calm of safety. In the dark, someone whispered, "Do you think they'll kill us later?" No one answered. The next morning, a guard opened the door and pointed toward a small outbuilding. "For personal care," he said. Inside, the women found combs, soap, and towels neatly stacked on wooden shelves. And once again, mirrors. They looked at each other, uncertain. It was Greta who said it first, "They're letting us choose how to look." It sounded absurd, but it was true. No one barked orders about uniformity, no one measured the length of their hair or the angle of their caps. When a nurse asked if she could braid her hair differently, the American shrugged. "It's your hair." That phrase, "it's your hair," spread through the camp like a spark. They had been trained to obey, to march, to dress alike, to erase individuality in the name of the fatherland. Now, for the first time, they were being told that they could decide something, even something as small as how to wear their hair. One woman, a former Red Cross volunteer, asked for scissors. The guard hesitated, then fetched a small pair from the sewing supplies. When she cut the first lock, the sound was soft but shocking, the first sound of freedom they'd heard in years. That night, as they washed their faces before bed, Greta stood in front of the mirror again. The woman looking back still carried the past in her eyes, but this time, she also carried something else. A question. If the enemy treated them as human, what did that make everything they had believed before? She didn't have an answer. Not yet. But the reflection was starting to look familiar again. Where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe to this channel. The sound of scissors was louder than the guards' boots. It started quietly, a single woman sitting by the window of the barracks, her fingers trembling as she lifted a strand of her hair. The morning light fell across her face, sharp and pale, making the silver in her eyes flicker like broken glass. Her name was Anna Fischer, a nurse from Hamburg. She had spent the last 2 years patching together bodies she could never save. Now, in this quiet camp in Kansas, she was trying to patch together something else, herself. On the table in front of her lay a small pair of sewing scissors. The Americans had handed them out the day before, along with needles and thread. For mending clothes, the guard had said. He didn't realize what else could be mended. Anna hesitated. Around her, the other women watched silently, as if waiting for permission to breathe. Their uniforms, stripped of insignia, but still gray, still heavy, seemed to hold them in the past. She looked into the mirror nailed crookedly on the wall. For a long time, she didn't move. Then, snip. A lock of hair fell onto the floor. Someone gasped. The scissors clicked again. Then again. The rhythm grew louder, steadier, until the sound filled the whole room. It was the rhythm of change, sharp and deliberate. Greta Schultz, who shared Anna's bunk, whispered, "If they wanted to kill us, they wouldn't let us look like this." The thought hung in the air, strange and dangerous. By midday, nearly half the women had followed Anna's lead. Some trimmed their hair short like soldiers, others let it fall loose around their shoulders, small rebellions, each one a declaration that they were still alive. The American supervisor, a nurse named Evelyn from Texas, stood by the door, arms crossed, watching. She didn't stop them. When one woman nervously asked, in broken English, aloud, Evelyn smiled just enough to show she understood. "Go ahead," she said. The phrase spread faster than any order could have, "Go ahead." For the women of the Reich, those 2 words were more radical than freedom itself. For years, their lives had been scripted, uniforms pressed to regulation, hair braided by rule, emotions hidden behind slogans. Now, they were told they could simply go ahead. By afternoon, the barracks looked like a storm had passed through. Hair scattered across the floor, sunlight catching on the gold and brown strands like confetti. Some women laughed. Others wept without knowing why. A few knelt by the mirror, tracing the new outlines of their faces with trembling hands. Anna stared at her reflection. The woman who looked back was not the nurse of the Reich, not the servant of ideology, but someone stripped bare, uncertain, almost young again. She touched her cheek and whispered, "So this is what's left." That night, the barracks smelled of soap and metal. Someone had found an old harmonica, and faint music drifted through the camp, mixing with the distant chirp of insects. The American guards didn't understand the words the women spoke, but they recognized the sound of laughter, brittle, uneven, but real. One of them, Private Tom Daly, wrote in a letter home. "They look different now. Not like soldiers. More like the girls back home when they get ready for church. I didn't think I'd ever see Germans smile." The next morning, the sun rose over Camp Concordia, catching the gleam of freshly washed hair through the windows. When the women filed out for roll call, even the officers hesitated. They didn't look like prisoners anymore. Some of the guards joked quietly among themselves, "Guess we'll need barbers now." But others looked uneasy, as if something invisible had shifted. These women were not breaking rules, they were breaking definitions. In her diary, Greta wrote, "We thought they wanted to humiliate us. Instead, they gave us back our reflection. And it frightened us more than punishment ever could. Days passed, and the atmosphere of the camp began to change. The women spoke more softly now, sometimes even humming as they worked in the laundry or tended to the small garden near the fence. The Americans didn't interfere, they seemed to understand that discipline alone couldn't win this kind of war. Then, one morning, as the women gathered for inspection, a truck rolled through the gates carrying something unexpected, large brown boxes tied with red ribbons. The guards unloaded them and left them by the door of the mess hall. The women exchanged wary glances. No one knew what was inside. Food? Supplies? Or another test of obedience? When the boxes were opened, a hush fell over the courtyard. Inside were small mirrors, combs, and lipstick. Bright, unapologetic red. The kind they had seen only in old magazines before the war. For a moment, no one moved. Then Anna reached out and picked one up, her fingers trembling. She turned it in her hand like a forbidden relic. The label read, Revlon Victory Red. She looked up at the others and said softly, almost in disbelief, "They think we should look beautiful." No one laughed this time. Because beauty, after years of uniformity, fear, and death, felt more dangerous than hate. And as they stared at the lipsticks glinting in the Kansas sunlight, one question echoed through every woman's mind. If the war had taken everything, what were they supposed to do with this? They gave us lipstick. Red. Bright. Like victory, but not ours. The boxes sat on the mess hall table all morning, sunlight glinting off the silver tubes. None of the women dared touch them again. They had been trained to see vanity as sin, luxury as treason. In the Reich, beauty had rules, it belonged to the propaganda posters, to the Aryan ideal, not to the women who cleaned blood from the floors of field hospitals. So they stood and stared. The camp commandant finally stepped forward, holding one of the lipsticks between his fingers. "Gift," he said in broken German. "From ladies in town. For you." Then he set it down and left. The door closed. Silence. It was Hilda who broke it, a young woman with hair so pale it looked white in the light. She had been a radio operator, her knuckles still scarred from years of code work. Without a word, she picked up the lipstick, twisted the base, and watched the color rise like a tiny red flame. Someone gasped. Someone else muttered, "Put it down." But she didn't. Hilda stepped toward the mirror on the wall, the same one that had shown them their hollow faces weeks earlier. Her reflection waited, gray, tired, stripped of everything that used to define her. With one slow motion, she drew the color across her lips. The room froze. The red was too vivid, too alive. It didn't belong in a prisoner's world. Yet there it was, proof that something human had survived. Hilda looked at her reflection and whispered, "It feels like blood, but warm." A few of the women began to laugh, quietly at first, then louder, as if the sound itself could erase the years of silence. Others covered their mouths, ashamed of how good it felt to see color again. An American guard standing outside peeked through the window. Later, he told a reporter, they were just women. Not enemies. Just women trying to remember what that means. That evening, Greta Schultz wrote in her diary. "For the first time since the war began, someone looked at me and didn't see a uniform. They saw a person. And I didn't know how to handle it." By the next day, the change was impossible to ignore. Tiny smudges of red began appearing in the camp, on a smile in the meal line, on a face bent over laundry, even on the cheeks of a nurse who used the lipstick as rouge. It wasn't defiance. It was resurrection. The American women from the nearby town noticed. They began sending more boxes, combs, brushes, even perfume samples. A note came with one package, from one woman to another, "The war is over." But not everyone approved. Some local men complained in the newspapers, "Why pamper the enemy?" The Kansas City Herald sent a photographer to cover what it called the strangest camp in America. He arrived on a cloudless afternoon, camera slung over his shoulder, expecting grim faces behind barbed wire. Instead, he found laughter. Women in pale uniforms smiling shyly, some waving, others ducking away from the lens. One of them, Hilda, though he never learned her name, turned just as he clicked the shutter. The red on her lips flared in the sunlight like a banner. That photograph ran 2 days later under the headline, "German POWs treated kindly in Kansas camp." Across the country, the reaction was instant, and divided. Some readers wrote letters praising American mercy. Others were furious. "My son died fighting them," one mother wrote. "And now we're giving them lipstick." In the camp, the women didn't know about the outrage. They only knew that the guards had become quieter, more careful around them, as if the sight of color on their lips made them harder to hate. Greta noticed it too. One night, as she and Anna walked back from the dining hall, an American soldier stopped them. He looked young, barely old enough to shave. For a moment, he just stared, not with hostility, but with something like confusion. "My sister wore that color before she enlisted," he said softly, then walked away. Anna looked at Greta and whispered, "Maybe that's what scares them, that we remind them of someone they loved." That night, Greta added one more line to her diary. "The mirror is no longer frightening. It's dangerous. Because now, when we look into it, we see that we could have been them, and they could have been us." The next morning, the guards announced that visitors from Washington would arrive to inspect the camp. Orders went out, uniforms pressed, beds made, everything spotless. As the women prepared, Hilda reached for her lipstick. Greta hesitated. "Better not," she warned. "They might take it away." Hilda smiled faintly and slipped it into her pocket. "Let them try." She didn't know it yet, but by that afternoon, her face, and her color, would appear on front pages across America. And once again, the world would argue about what mercy should look like. When the photo hit the newspapers, America didn't know whether to smile, or to rage. August 1945, the Topeka Daily Capital. Front page, above the fold, 5 German prisoners of war, women, standing in Kansas sunlight, hair cropped neat, uniforms laundered, a hint of lipstick catching the light. Their smiles were small, uncertain. The caption read, "Former enemies, now ladies again." In the camp, the paper arrived in a brown bundle tossed from a truck. A guard slit the twine and paused, the top sheet staring back at him with those careful smiles. He carried it to the office. Within an hour, the phone rang so steadily the line went hot in the operator's hand. From Abilene, a mother's voice cracked with fury, "My boy is buried in Lorraine. Why do they get lipstick?" From Wichita, a pastor wrote, "Mercy is the sign of a just victory. Remember that, even now." From St. Louis, a veteran scrawled in blue pencil, "They all wore uniforms. Don't dress them as victims." Stacks of letters followed, dozens, then hundreds, routed to the War Department, to the camp commandant, to the paper itself. Some wrapped their anger in patriotism, others in grief. A few, in quiet handwriting, said simply, "Maybe this is what peace should look like." The camp command post filled with paper, directives, clippings, a worn folder marked PR risk, female POW photos. An internal memo used the careful language of bureaucracy, public sensitivity acute. Recommend discretion imagery emphasizing comfort or beautification. Another note, handwritten in the margin, was less subtle, "No more lipstick pictures." Outside, the women tried to keep walking in straight lines. They had learned that posture was a shield. But the atmosphere had changed. The guards moved with a new formality, as if the camera were still watching. Voices fell to a hush whenever the mail sack arrived. On the laundry line, a copy of the paper fluttered like a flag no one had chosen. Greta saw herself in the grain of the newsprint. Not in the photo, she wasn't one of the 5, but in the posture, the tilt of the head, the awkward hands. "They will hate us more for smiling than for fighting," she said, soft enough for only Anna to hear. That afternoon, the commandant gathered the senior guards. No interviews without clearance, he said, tapping the open paper with 2 fingers. Issue dress guidance. Uniforms neat. No, embellishments. He hesitated over the last word, as if it might explode. In the mess hall, the women passed the paper from table to table. Hilda turned the page carefully, eyes fixed on the photograph as if it might vanish if she blinked. "Do we look like that?" she asked. "Only when we forget," Anna said. "Forget what?" "The war." In town, the Topeka Daily Capital ran a follow-up, "Kindness at Camp Concordia spurs debate." The piece quoted letters on both sides and included a line from a War Department spokesman: "Our treatment of prisoners conforms to the Geneva Convention and reflects American values." It did not mention the lipsticks. But Life magazine had noticed. So had a wire service out of Chicago. Another memo arrived at the camp with a clipped tone: "Expect press visit within 72 hours. Prepare facilities. Emphasize order, discipline, constructive activities." The phrase constructive activities made everyone look at the knitting circle with new suspicion. Greta returned to the mirror that evening and studied the face that had not been printed. The glass gave everything back honestly: the crease between her brows, the pallor, the stubbornness. She rubbed at the faint stain of color still tucked at the corners of her lips and watched it fade. Behind her, the barracks breathed, coughs, murmurs, the scrape of a chair. "I don't know which they want," she said to no one, a monster or a girl. Across the wire, a group of local women arrived with a crate of donated books, poetry, nursing manuals, a tattered copy of Little Women. One of them, a teacher with a hat pinned too tightly to her hair, peered through the fence and seemed to flinch when a young prisoner smiled at her. She placed the books on the inspection table and left quickly, as if kindness might stain. The photographer who had taken the picture drove back out to the camp at dusk, hungry for another frame. The commandant declined. "We are under review," he said, eyes on the telephone, still ringing. The photographer stood for a moment by the gate and watched the women crossing the yard in twos, silhouettes long in the falling light. He lifted his camera, then lowered it. Some stories are heavier than a shutter. That night, the chaplain held a brief service in the corner of the yard. He spoke about victory and mercy in the plain phrases a farmer might use. The women didn't understand the words, but they understood his hands, open, not clenched. Afterward, he tore the front page from the paper and folded it into his Bible. He told the guard beside him, "People will decide what they're seeing long before they read what it says." The next morning, the rules shifted again. Mirrors stayed, but cosmetics were quietly set aside. The box from the Ladies' Aid Society was moved to the infirmary cabinet. Hilda slipped her lipstick into a shoe under her bunk. Not to hide, she told Greta, to remember. In Washington, an editor drafted a request: press access to Camp Concordia, human interest feature. The letter carried a name the commandant didn't recognize: Helen Rogers, Harper's Weekly. Her note was brief, written in a clean hand: "I'm not coming to expose anyone. I'm coming to listen." 3 days later, a convoy of reporters turned off the highway and rolled toward the camp in a cloud of dust. Among them, a woman in a plain suit sat with a notebook closed on her knee, watching the Kansas horizon sharpen into fence posts, barracks, and a small crowd of faces trying not to be seen. And with her arrival, the story everyone thought they understood began to change. She wasn't there to expose them. She was there to understand. Helen Rogers arrived in a gray government car, notebook in hand, hair pinned neat. No photographer followed her. She introduced herself to the commandant, requested a table, 2 chairs, and said simply, "I'll talk to them where they live." They met in the laundry room, bright, hot, walls sweating with steam. 15 women filed in, eyes lowered, uniforms pressed. Helen sat at the end of the table and asked, in a calm voice, "What's the first thing you'll do when you go home?" The interpreter repeated the question. Silence. Then a whisper from the back, "If there's a home left." Helen didn't interrupt. She waited. The faucet dripped. Someone shifted a stool. Then Anna Fisher spoke, describing kitchen duty, the library cart, the Texas nurse named Evelyn who treated their blisters and asked about their mothers. "She talks like a friend," Anna said. "I forgot how that sounds." Greta spoke next. She told of mirrors and the strange freedom of cutting one's hair. "They said it's up to us," she said softly. "We didn't know what to do with that kind of permission." When Helen asked about the lipstick, Hilda looked up, her lips bare now. "In the Reich, color was propaganda. When I put it on here, I remembered my sister before the war. We used to steal her mother's rouge and laugh until we cried." Helen wrote quickly. "Mirrors, control, color, identity, kindness, disorientation." She glanced up again. "Do you feel guilty?" Greta answered without hesitation. "Every day. I cleaned the blood off floors. I did my job well. Does that make me good?" Helen didn't respond. She wrote it down exactly as said. After the interview, she walked the yard. The Kansas sky stretched flat and endless. 2 prisoners were tending a small garden near the fence, a few tomatoes, a single sunflower. They looked fragile but alive. Helen thought of a memo she'd read in Washington, "Psychological decompression, restoring civilian identity through ordinary ritual." She wondered if the writer had ever seen faces like these. That night she began her article, titling it, "The Faces of Surrender." She wrote that what the public called pampering was, in truth, the slow rebuilding of humanity. "The red on their lips is not vanity," she wrote, "but a scar remembering how to heal." Before leaving, she asked one last question. "What would you say to the mothers who lost sons?" Hilda's voice was barely a whisper. "I'd tell them the color isn't joy. It's proof I remember what pain looks like." Anna added, "We're learning how to be safe with our faces again." Helen closed her notebook, shook their hands, and left the room. The guard at the gate said, "Ma'am, you'll catch trouble for writing about them." She replied, "So will we all, if we don't." A week later, Harper's Weekly printed her piece. The reactions were fierce. Some readers praised the compassion, "Maybe mercy is strength." Others raged, "Our boys died, and we give their killers lipstick." Letters poured in, each a mirror of the nation's split heart. In the camp, a copy hung on the bulletin board. The women gathered around it. Greta traced a sentence with her finger, then stepped back. "She didn't write us as prisoners," she said. "She wrote us as people." That night, no one spoke. For weeks, they had fought to feel human again. Now, being seen so clearly felt heavier than the chains that once bound them. The next morning, Anna didn't come to roll call. Evelyn, the nurse, found her sitting on her bunk, staring at her hands. "I can't wear their kindness," Anna whispered. "Not until I know who I was before." And for the first time, the women understood that forgiveness, even the gentle kind, demanded its own kind of courage. "They gave us mirrors so we could see our faces, but we saw everything we'd done." By autumn 1945, the war was over. Camp Concordia began to empty. The Kansas wind carried the smell of dust and wet wood as the first trucks arrived to take the prisoners home. The women packed their things in silence, a few folded dresses, letters, small photographs, and the strange souvenirs of captivity, a comb, a pair of scissors, a broken mirror. In the barracks, the mirrors still hung above the basins. Some of the women lingered before them, not to admire, but to remember. The reflections were older now, lined, sunburned, human again. They no longer flinched at what they saw. Greta stood by the window, watching a column of soldiers load crates onto the truck. On her bunk lay the red lipstick, worn down to a dull stub. She picked it up, held it between her fingers, then set it on the table. "I don't need it anymore," she said. Anna, sitting across from her, looked up. "Take it. Freedom is not something you owe anyone." Outside, an American nurse named Evelyn moved through the rows of departing women, checking names against the list. She had been here since the beginning, part guard, part medic, part confessor. When she reached Anna, she hesitated. The two women looked at each other for a long time before Evelyn spoke. "War made us all less human," she said quietly. "Maybe this is how we fix it." Anna didn't answer. She only nodded and stepped into line. As the convoy rumbled away, the camp grew quieter than it had ever been. The guards stood at attention, hats in hand. One of them muttered, "Strange, isn't it? We'll miss them." A chaplain walked through the empty barracks that evening. On one of the mirrors, someone had written in lipstick, "Where Laban, we live." He wiped at it with his sleeve, but the faint red shadow remained. Weeks later, Red Cross reports confirmed what everyone already knew: the women were being repatriated, sent back to a country in ruins. Some would find their towns gone, others their families scattered. But each left wearing civilian clothes, hair neat, faces clean, small gestures meant to prepare them for a world that might not want them back. In the War Department files, an officer added a note: "Humanitarian treatment appears effective in reducing bitterness and aiding transition to peace." Cold words, but somewhere beneath them lived the truth, that dignity, once restored, is hard to destroy again. Evelyn received 2 letters in the months that followed. The first came from Bremen, a careful hand in broken English. "Dear Miss, I am home. There is nothing left, but I remember the kindness. You taught me to hold my head up again." The second, unsigned, contained only one sentence: "The mirror you gave me shows a stranger, but at least she is alive." By spring, the camp was dismantled. The barracks came down plank by plank. The field where the women had planted their small garden turned back to grass. Only the concrete foundations remained, pale rectangles in the soil, catching the sunlight like the outlines of vanished rooms. Years later, when the land was turned into farmland again, the new owner found one of the old mirrors buried near the fence line. The glass was cracked, the backing tarnished, but it still caught the sky. He cleaned it, hung it in his barn, and thought nothing more of it. But sometimes, when the light hit at a certain hour, the reflection seemed to hold more than his own face, as if behind him stood a row of women, young and tired, brushing their hair and waiting for the next roll call that would never come. In the end, no one kept count of what was lost or found in Camp Concordia. The official record spoke of discipline, diet, repatriation, the language of bureaucracy. The stories that mattered lived elsewhere, in the touch of a comb, in a shared mirror, in a quiet conversation between enemies who had stopped seeing each other as such. They had come as prisoners, certain the world would punish them. Instead, they learned something harder: that mercy is its own kind of mirror, and it forces you to look. When the last truck disappeared beyond the prairie, the camp fell silent again. The wind pressed through the open gates, carrying the sound of rustling leaves like distant applause. They thought they had lost everything: their country, their cause, their certainty. But in that place, surrounded by barbed wire and kindness, they discovered the one victory that no army can plan for. It wasn't freedom. It wasn't forgiveness. It was the fragile, indestructible truth that even after war, a human face can still find its way back to itself.